Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. Since right now there's only a few of us, I think anybody should feel free to jump in with questions that they might have as I'm talking. And I'm happy to kind of pause and pick up on those. Today I'm going to talk, hopefully relatively briefly. I'll try and keep it under 40 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for questions and any other discussion we might want. And I think what I'll try and do today is give a brief overview of some of the scholarship and what people are saying about how plantation sites and plantation museums represent slavery to their visitors. And then I'll talk a little bit about how some of these ideas have been taken up across the country, and then a little bit about kind of some of the obstacles that sites face in changing their interpretations. And I'll close with a brief sort of suggestion of some of the ways that other sites and scholars have offered to look forward. So I am going to share my screen briefly here, which makes it a little harder for me to see exactly who's doing what in chat. So if I miss a chat or anything like that, feel free to just unmute yourself and let me know. Okay. So today, I imagine a good portion of you are from Louisiana or live in Louisiana and are familiar with the River Road, the highway out of New Orleans along the Mississippi River. And if you go along that road today, you can find dozens of meticulously preserved plantation sites. And if you stop to visit them, you'll often pay a sizable admission fee. And a guide will tour you around what they might call the big house and grounds, paying great attention to details of the furniture, the art and architecture, and the gardens, while paying considerably less attention to how these items were produced and the conditions that made the accumulation of this wealth possible. So today we're going to try and dig into that a little bit. And as I said, I'll start by talking about how Louisiana and sites in Louisiana represent the history of slavery at plantation sites, how these narratives are taken up, what are some of the impediments to representing histories of slavery truthfully and ethically. And I think that's a key qualifier. I think frequently sites that represent slavery find it easier to commit to true history than history that is both true and represented ethically. And I'll kind of get into what I mean by that. And then finally, I'll talk about what ways forward have not only scholars, but other plantation sites and so on suggested that we can kind of look to. So to begin, I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that plantation sites have been categorized by scholars. And here specifically, I'm drawing on one book that I'll talk about in a minute. And they have 4 kind of academic terms to categorize how these sites represent the history of slavery. The one that they see as most egregious, they call symbolic annihilation and erasure, essentially a total refusal to recognize that slavery existed. Then they have a next stage they call trivialization and deflection, where there's mention of slavery and its history, but it's seen as not bad there or just pushed to the side. The third type they call segregation and marginalization of knowledge, by which they mean there is material that is usually relatively accurate about slavery, but it's presented as an exhibit in a separate room or a separate tour, something outside of the main experience. And then finally, they have relative incorporation, which is that slavery is represented as it was in historical reality as a central part of the history of these sites. And so they have these 4 categories. And the people who did this were 2 scholars, Dr. Stephen Small, who's a professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Jennifer Eichstead, professor of sociology at Humboldt State University. And they wrote this book, and they did the research by together visiting, I can't remember the exact number, it's somewhere between 40 and 70 plantation museums across the South. and they would go on tours separately. Dr. Small would go on a tour himself to see how the guides and the docents would pitch the tour to an African-American visitor. And Dr. Eichstead would go and pitch the tour to how they would represent it to a white visitor. And they compiled their findings in this book, Representations of Slavery, Race and Ideology in Southern Plantation Museums. And if you're interested in this topic, especially if you work at one of these museums, I think it's really fascinating. And I'll be drawing on some of its findings here. There is a qualifier, of course. And in this case, the qualifier is that the book was published in 2002. So its findings, while meticulous and well reviewed, are approaching 20 years old. So there's obviously been significant change from 2002 to 2021. So what they call symbolic annihilation and erasure is sites largely ignoring the presence of slavery and enslaved people. And they find a majority, 55.7%, of sites engage in this kind of erasure. And as I mentioned, all the sites they went to were in the South and dedicated plantation museums. They talk about some of the strategies that these places use to erase the history of slavery. In particular, they talk about a lot of use of passive voice, meaning instead of saying like John Jones attacked enslaved people on his plantation, they would say the slaves were attacked or something like that. That eliminates the enslaver from being the person doing something. And they would also use a lot of euphemisms. One that some of you may have seen if you've been to many of these sites, servant, frequently used in place of slave or enslaved person. And all sorts of kind of language ranging from war between the states or war of northern aggression in sort of larger context down to, servant. And I think a good example of a site that in 2021 still fully fits this category is Nottoway Plantation, which you may have heard of. It's relatively famous. It's sometimes called the White Castle. It's right on the Mississippi River, not too far upriver from New Orleans. It's a site that bills itself as a plantation and resort and advertises itself primarily as the largest antebellum pre-Civil War mansion in the United States. They've installed tennis courts, conference centers, and all sorts of things. And if you go on the tour of this site, you will find essentially no mention of slavery or enslaved people at all. There is one short video in like literally a basement room that has a little bit of mention of this. But essentially, this is an example of a place that wants to represent itself as a site of leisure that romanticizes a old South that never existed. And you can see here, this photo, despite this watermark, actually comes from the Nottoway Plantation website. And it's of a couple, I don't know if they're real or not, but being represented getting married there. And marriages are a significant part of their business. Then we look at this second category, trivialization and deflection. Just over a quarter of these plantation museums, and these are the sites you might be familiar with as saying, slavery wasn't that bad, or it was bad, but enslaved people on this particular plantation were treated well. They had a kindly master. And we find this kind of language that doesn't refuse to acknowledge slavery, but refuses to acknowledge it truthfully. And I think an odd example, but a fair example of this is the museum at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also referred to as Angola. And it's a museum that talks about the penitentiary going back to its origins as an amalgamation of several plantations, one of which was named Angola, and continued its history of forced labor up through the present. And this image that I have here is from an exhibit, Slavery, the Prison Industrial Complex, by Keith and Chandra McCormick, two New Orleans photographers and artists who really highlight the reality that forms of slavery are legally, under the 13th Amendment, being perpetuated here in Angola. And at their museum, they will acknowledge elements of forced labor. They won't use the word slavery, but they will quickly say that those things are fully in the past and have moved away from the present. The third category, segregation and marginalization of knowledge, basically having fairly robust histories of slavery at sites, but not being willing to integrate them into the main tours, the big house tour, is also pretty common at about 14%. I think probably the best example of this in Louisiana is Alley Plantation, which I think is the most highly visited plantation, at least in Louisiana. And at Alley, in recent years, they have decided to try to interpret the history of slavery at Alley after receiving a lot of criticism for not doing so. And what they settled on was they constructed, I can't remember, it's either 6 or 8 replica cabins that they think reflect what the cabins of enslaved people at Alley had once looked like. And they've installed exhibits inside most of them. But it's a separate tour that's called Slavery at Alley. So if you go to the main tour that they heavily advertise and that people most people come to Alley to see, it does not include much mention of slavery at all. You can get a mint julep to bring inside the house, but you won't hear much about slavery. And this corridor that they've created with these cabins, instead of being part of the main tour, is actually like push up against their sort of revenue generating elements like the gift shop and the restaurant and things like that, which definitely takes away from the gravity of it. And then finally, relative incorporation is under 4% of plantation museums. I think that might be a little bit higher now in 2021. An emphasis on the centrality of slavery, a focus on enslaved people throughout the site, throughout the tour. And I think the best example of that in Louisiana is probably the Whitney Plantation Museum, which is a museum specifically dedicated to the history of slavery, not to the history of plantations or anything like that. I imagine many of you may have been there. If not, I encourage you to. It does a lot of things in ways that I think can be really generative for what other plantation sites could do, right? Unlike most of them, there's a heavy emphasis on the cultural ties, but also the actual personal ties of early generations of enslaved people to West Africa and Central Africa. It doesn't just focus on the moments that they're on the plantation. And I think this is possible because they've looked to decenter the plantation. And by that, I mean, Whitney has not concerned itself primarily with preservation of existing buildings, although that has been something they have done in parts. They have concerned themselves primarily with using the plantation site that they have to tell the history of slavery in the area. So the difference is they do have a quote unquote big house there that is preserved. It's a very small part of the tour. But most of the other buildings on the site actually came from elsewhere and were chosen because they well represent certain types of buildings and allow the museum to tell the history that they're seeking to tell, rather than from the fact that they happen to be present on this particular land. So I think that's one interesting way. A more traditional one that has not done this completely, but has worked hard to integrate, not just recently, but in the past decade plus, the history of slavery at their site is Laura Plantation nearby. also in the River Road area. I have not been there for about 3 or 4 years, so I don't know their exact status. Last time I was there, they were just opening an exhibit specifically dedicated to slavery, which might have fit the sort of segregation model. But they did make efforts throughout their tours and stuff to mention slavery at least, so they probably might offer a kind of in-between spot. But again, I haven't been there for a few years, so I don't want to say too much about that. So we have these 4 different branches, and that's just one interpretation. We could lump them together or split them apart more. But why is this so important? Why am I talking about plantation site museums instead of the histories that they are telling? And I think the reason is, if you look at a lot of polls, the places that Americans or residents of the US most trust to get their history from is not a history professor like myself, is not a textbook, is not peer-reviewed double-blind scholarship. It's museums and public sources of history, right? I mean, I don't think all polls fully agree, but there are several polls that have shown pretty firmly that museums are either the or among the most trusted sources of history, right? This is a little confusing to me always, because it's curators and professors and books that apparently are trusted less that create the museums. But even so, they have this hugely important role, right? And I think often there's an idea that a lot of people have that popular culture outside of museums is what informs it most, right? I hear frequently from my students when I ask them, like, what have you learned about this topic before coming to this class? Some of them will talk about visiting sites, plantation or otherwise. Some of them will talk about museums. A lot of them will talk about film, 12 Years a Slave, the TV show Underground, or Django Unchained. But I think museums tend to resonate a little bit more and provide deeper, firmer convictions about the knowledge and have more authority, which may not be a bad thing. Other students have told me that they've learned things from Gone with the Wind. And a few students have even mentioned The Birth of a Nation, which is a film you may not be familiar with unless you've been subjected to it in a film studies class, where it's very common required viewing. If you ever took a film studies class in high school or college, that would be something that would come up quite a bit. Sort of horrifyingly, but not unsurprisingly, these 2 films for a long time were the best-selling films in U.S. history, or highest box office films, corrected for inflation. The Birth of a Nation, which came out around World War I and helped spur a new version of the KKK. It tells the story of the founding of the first Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s during Reconstruction. Well, makes up. And then Gone with the Wind in the 1930s is the first film to actually overtake Birth of a Nation in box office receipts. And both of these films are there to present really toxic, incorrect, racist versions of Southern history as connected to plantation sites. So these plantation sites are really important, right? And they're really present for those of us living in Southern Louisiana, right? You can come to an intersection, and this is a photo from a New Orleans Times-Picayune article, but you can see here, like, we've probably seen these kind of signs if you drive in certain areas north of New Orleans along the river. Whitney Plantation this way, Laura Plantation this way, St. Joseph's this way, Oak Alley this way, right? You go in, if you fly into Armstrong Airport in New Orleans, you're going to see pamphlets all over for all sorts of things in New Orleans, but also all sorts of things on plantations, right? You drive north from New Orleans along the river, and there's plenty of cars, but there's a ton of stagecoach buses, right? Bringing like loads of tourists from outside of the area to learn their history at these plantation sites. And so what the stories or the narratives that are told at these sites are, again, hugely important. But often the authority that they're granted is abused, right? So here's a screenshot from a cooking show on TV, a competition cooking show, Top Chef, where they're having a crawfish challenge in front of Hummus House Plantation, right? And they're creating this kind of carnival atmosphere where chefs are, I don't have the actual clip to show you, but chefs are running around, dropping things, yelling, cursing, all of these things right here. And here are the judges. The one local one is Emerald right here. The images sort of low quality, so hard to see. So it's not that they don't know local context, right? It's active choices are being made. But there's a long history of this, right? And it's actually much less common now than it once was. I don't know. I didn't live in Louisiana in 1994, but in the 1990s, there was a show on Louisiana Public Broadcasting called A Taste of Louisiana with John Folse, a well-known chef. And I'm gonna have to switch my screen share to make this work here. John Folse is a well-known Southern chef, and he, let's see, he hosted this series. And I'll show you just about 2 minutes at the start of the series, of an episode.
Louisiana. I'm Chef John Folse, welcoming you to this great state of ours. These beautiful plantation homes reflect the fascinating history of our culture and cuisine, and I'd like to share this story with you. Why not join me and some of my friends as we visit the plantation homes of our state and cook up another great taste of Louisiana?
Funding for this program was provided in part by Bruce Foods Corporation, makers of Louisiana Gold and other distinctive Louisiana-style food products. Additional funding is provided by the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. Gumbo, Etouffee, Jambalaya, Beignet. Come pass a good time in Louisiana and say things you've never seen before.
When David Weeks built his plantation on the banks of Bayou Teche in 1834, little did he realize that the home would remain in his family throughout its entire history. The Weeks family proved to be great record keepers and kept journals on everything from lifestyle in the 1800s to advancements in medicine and agriculture, and even a few notes on fashion. It was because of the over 17,000 original documents discovered in the attic of this house that today we have a much better understanding of life and times on an early Louisiana plantation. I'm Chef John Folse. Welcome to Shadows on the Teche. Under construction from 1830.
So we can see there, this is not to single out shadows in any way. This was a very widespread program. There's Melrose, Magnolia, pretty much everyone you can name had an episode of this show. I just chose Shadows for this one because it seemed the most pertinent. And shows like this often are not actually presenting, I mean, there are some parts of this one, but histories that are factually incorrect. They're presenting histories that give an incorrect assumption based on what they omit, right? And so, and also by the choice to pair a location that was the site of, you know, death and slavery with a cooking show without acknowledgement of that, right, is a particular choice, I guess we could say. But it's not just cooking shows, right? I have to admit, I don't really know how this show works, but a friend of mine sent me this. It's a show called The Bachelor, which is apparently a dating, I mean, I know it's a dating show, but apparently they have challenges each episode in which, I don't know, the people somehow compete for this guy's affection. This particular one involved going to Huma's house, a well-known Louisiana plantation, in which they crafted a ghost story and then challenged the women to stay overnight in the plantation site or plantation house, right? Throughout the whole thing, there's no mention whatsoever of slavery. And much like with the cooking show, right, we see like a carnivalesque atmosphere on the part of some of the contestants, running around, screaming, and all sorts of things like this. So for many people, like, as much as there's an acknowledgement of the brutality of slavery and the horrors of the institution, a lot of individuals are asked by culture to separate plantations from that violence. And there's a lot of ways that plantation museums find impediments to telling truthful and ethical narratives, right? Some of them do, and some of them struggle to. When I talk to people who are looking to shift interpretation at their sites, I haven't done this with Shadows, so just for the record, this is not based on that. The things that are cited are finances. There just isn't the money. Visitors' desires, even though I've misplaced an apostrophe there. Saying, well, people want this kind of history or they're not going to come here. Sometimes uncertainty about how to go about doing it, or not having consultants or expertise. And finally, inertia, which is something that is hard for a lot of public history sites, given how they tend to be underfunded. Weddings are one of the most frequent kind of things brought up in discussions over finances at plantation sites. Some plantations bring in $25,000 or more for a wedding. When we're looking at places like Boone Hall in South Carolina, pictured here, Oak Alley in Louisiana, Nottoway, places like that are bringing in $15,000 to $25,000 for a weekend for a plantation, which is significant money. But as you can see, there are consequences even for the crass bean counters, perhaps. You might notice in this image, the face of the two people who got married there are blurred. It's because these individuals who had a wedding at Boone Hall later were ashamed of it and spoke to a reporter about it, but even so didn't want their real identities revealed, right? And so increasingly, there's been a lot of financial consequence in terms of a cost for this kind of behavior, right? Like a bunch of major wedding websites have started refusing to list plantation weddings. And we also see sites like Whitney Plantation Museum with a huge number of visitors, national press attention, and so on, very much for pushing back on that. Whitney, to my knowledge, has held a couple weddings, but they've been in their church there and only for descendants of enslaved people in that area, which is a very different situation, obviously. Again, with my sort of misplaced apostrophe, people often who work at plantation sites, especially those who have people above them who are owned by either for-profit groups or nonprofits that have goals that require a lot of cash input, say our visitors want this. They don't want a downer, right? They don't want to be told constantly about violence and slavery and how bad things were. But I think this is a real trap, right? And I've had these conversations at places where I'm on boards and so on. It assumes a particular visitor. I think it assumes a white visitor. And it doesn't realize that if the visitor's coming through their doors and paying for admission, want this one narrative, there's a reason why other people are not coming through those doors and paying admission. It's because they don't want that narrative, right? They want a different, more accurate, more truthful narrative. So I think that this impediment is one that could also sort of a false barrier. Expertise is a real one, right? Even when you have people who have the right knowledge, resource, and expertise, they may very well be overstretched, overtaxed, and unable to do much more than make sure the doors stay open, right? There are constant issues over that. There may be more resources needed. On the plus side, I think there's been a recent outpouring of scholarship on the public history of slavery and on plantation sites. And much of this, what I'm calling scholarship, because it is not confined to the pages of academic journals or university press monographs, but is happening on blogs, on social media, and other places, and which makes it much more accessible to a larger group of people. And finally, inertia. As I've said, I can't emphasize this enough, with most public history sites, limited resources, staff time, and energy plague all but the luckiest public history sites, right? So even if you have a staff that is committed to reshaping interpretation that they're dissatisfied with, it is going to take time and resources. And that's why I'm excited that Shadows has secured this grant to help them have the resources to do that, because a lot of places that would like to just aren't able to. So I think there has to be both the desire and determination to tell a truthful and ethical story, and there also has to be the resources. And to be honest, in my experience, both of those things are scarce, and I'm glad there seem to be both here. Limited community support is common. I think with the Iberia African American Historical Society, Shadows has a lot of support here in New Iberia, so it's maybe less of an issue. And I think maybe there's small glimmers of hope. This image is from 2018. It's from the River Parishes Tourist Commission, and they voted to retain their slogan, Plantation Country. There was controversy over this, and activists pushed back on labeling this region of Southeast Louisiana as plantation country. But it was pushed through. But continued activism and outcry led to this being discontinued in 2020. I wish I knew more about the process. I know a lot of people worked hard on that, but I'm not privy to the details. But as of summer 2020, this slogan was finally taken away by the Tourist Commission. So as we start to wrap up a little bit and leave some time for questions, what now? I'm a history professor, so I'm always going to say that we should do some reading and have some education. But what else? There's discussion with national experts. As I've said, Dr. Ibrahim Asek is the director at Whitney Plantation and an internationally recognized expert in the field. And many of his staff at Whitney, I know, have helped work with other sites to share their experience in the sort of road they blazed. And I think the thing that I'll sort of take the last few minutes for is this idea of going beyond truth. That truth is absolutely necessary, a necessary precondition, but it's not on its own sufficient. There needs to be a constant consideration about what the cost of telling particular truths is and what it means to reproduce trauma, because we can think of scenarios where a plantation site is truthfully describing the violence and torture that enslavers inflicted upon enslaved people. But if that is being repeated over and over and over, at a certain point, the site is kind of reveling in it, using it to titillate or frighten or arouse other feelings in visitors beyond simply knowing the truth. And it starts to become a little dangerous, I think. This is not necessarily, this part of it is not my expertise. So here's where I'm going to turn to reading suggestions for people who have much more expertly laid this out than I have. I think I spoke earlier. Jade said these would be posted online when I get them to her, so I don't think there's a worry to write them down if you're interested. I just listed again the title of the book I talked about early on, Representations of Slavery. The other three pieces, 2 books and an article, I think are really good at thinking through questions of the ethics of how we represent histories of slavery. So the first 2 are books, and they're written by Saidiya Hartman, who recently won a MacArthur Genius Grant. She's a professor at Columbia University in New York, and she's written other books and many articles, but the 2 that I sort of highlight here, one is called Scenes of Subjection, and the other is called Lose Your Mother. And the first one, Scenes of Subjection, is about sort of literature and so on, but really what a lot of what she works through is at what point does telling these true stories and how we see them end up becoming a little perverse, right? End up becoming something that's people are reveling in pain. It's a very difficult book to read. I'm not going to lie. I have a hard time with it, but it's very rewarding. And then the second one, which is a bit easier to work through for me at least, is called Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. And Hartman, who's based in New York, as I said, wrote this book when she was on a fellowship for a year or 2, I think it was 1 year, in West Africa, in Ghana. And it's kind of specific to Ghana. And she goes back and she looks at like slave castles and memorials to slavery in Ghana and thinks through ways to represent slavery that I think, even though it's specific to Ghana, she is US based and she's thinking through them in a US context as well. And she has some really kind of generative ideas. And then the third thing I mentioned was an article by Catherine McKittrick called Plantation Futures. She's a geographer working in Black studies who her piece Plantation Futures asks us to think about a concept that actually sort of Hartman comes up with, the afterlife of slavery, and think about what does it mean to stop our interpretation on plantations in 1865, right? The social relations that are caused by slavery don't end there. What is our responsibility as people trying to interpret slavery on plantation sites to continue that history past the juridical end in 1865 of the institution of slavery? And then I have a couple options that, if you're not interested in dense academic tomes or articles, might be a little more appealing. Here's a book I've taught before, The Cutting Season by Attica Locke. It's a novel. It's sort of a mystery, sort of a murder mystery, but I think it reads really well. You can see it was a national bestseller, but I think it does a really good job of seriously thinking through the questions of what it means to represent slavery on a plantation site. The main character, the protagonist, is a Black woman in her 30s who's managing a plantation that she grew up around. It's set in the present day, right? And so it's one that Locke has said was inspired by her attending a wedding at Oak Alley. And so she's thinking through these questions of what these sites mean. And then the last sort of reading I might suggest is a chapter from a book, The Lemonade Reader, by Lakeisha Simmons at the University of Michigan. Dr. Simmons actually gave the keynote address at the conference that Pat mentioned at the start that I hosted a few years ago. And her work, regardless of the title, is about the representation of memory and Black women and slavery on Louisiana plantations in Beyonce's Lemonade video or film. And so it's just one chapter in this book, which is a collection of many different essays. And these are a couple of the images that Dr. Simmons highlighted, where she's trying to look at what she sees as Beyonce's sort of contrast of the brutal, violent past of sugar plantations with the possibility for healing in the present. And the final thing I'll mention before I go, or before we go on to discussion, is one thing that has often been a point of concern when I've talked to people at museums and public history sites and plantation sites that are looking to represent slavery is what language and terminology to use. And my personal belief is that there isn't a checklist of terms to use, but that what is really important is the people involved have serious conversations about why they're choosing the terms they do. Because I think really there's not much use in just choosing the right term because you ran a list of terms to use, right? It's important to know why you're choosing the words you're choosing, especially when you're choosing words that are controversial, highly debated, and central to the interpretation of any plantation museum, right? Something as basic as, do you say slave or enslaved person, right? There's an argument over this, and it's not simply one is more correct than the other. The argument for using enslaved person over slave is that slave reduces someone's identity to the status of being enslaved, whereas enslaved person removes the status from their core identity and makes it something they're currently burdened with. And I want to be clear, like, I'm not suggesting one is better than the other. You can find like the most current scholarship in history and Black studies that use both of them, right? There is not a consensus on which term, for example, is a better term, but scholars have made choices. And so what I would suggest is there's a great document by Gabrielle Foreman, who's a professor at the University of, I think she just moved to Penn State, called Writing About Slavery, This Might Help. And she crowdsourced it with a series of other senior Black women scholars in the field. And I can drop it in the chat, I think, maybe. It's just like 2 pages. And one of the things I really like about it is that it's thoughtful. It's produced by a lot of people who've spent often careers working through these issues. But it's also not prescriptive. It's not saying use this term, don't use this. They're saying here are the terms we have decided that we prefer. What we want is kind of what I was saying earlier. We want the discussion. We want you to know why you want to use a term, right? And they don't just say use this, don't use this. They say we prefer this to this for these reasons. And I found when teaching courses, which has some overlap, although certainly not one-to-one to museums, that explaining reasoning often really helps persuade people more so than just saying do this, not that. So I'm going to stop there. I've already gone to 45 minutes. So thank you all for having me. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer questions, but also to have a discussion that doesn't necessarily have to involve me. It can be between people in the audience, anybody who's interested in discussing some of the things that have come up.
Does anyone in the room have any questions or comments or?
Yeah. They recognize you.
Mm-hmm.
Ian, how you doing? This is Jim.
Doing well. How are you?
Good lecture. That's my only comment. I felt like I was back in a history course or an anthropology class.
Thank you.
You haven't lost your edge up in Colorado. Take care.
You too.
Oh, you asked a question. Is there anybody working to get data? I'm a math guy.
Mm-hmm.
On more recent, on what the status is in even the year 2020, much less today.
Okay.
Is anybody working on that?
Did you catch that, Ian?
I think so. It was the question,
Okay.
Is there more recent data from 2020 or today about, is that in the context of those categories I mentioned at the start of the class or start the talk?
No,
I'm teaching too much.
Would you,
Yeah.
4 categories.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. That book, the reason I use it is just because there hasn't been anything else like it that systematic. I will say there's work that's being done right now that's much more locally focused that does things like that. So Mary Battle wrote a PhD thesis on the Charleston area in South Carolina that does stuff like this. And I'm blanking on her name. Emma Walcott Wilson also did one on something similar, but it was also in South Carolina. The University of South Carolina has a big public history program, graduate program, so they have a lot of students working on questions related to this. I'm not aware of anything really recent on Louisiana.
PhD. Topic, a good dissertation topic.
Well, UL
Yeah.
is the public history.
Department.
We do. I've suggested
So,
this.
Okay.
yeah, so that's what Doc Boris is saying, that we need some PhD candidates out of UL to do that for us.
Yeah, we're limited to a master's program, but it could definitely be something they could do.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it is just a master. Just a master. Yeah. Anyways, anything else? Anyone in the virtual world? Questions, comments, thoughts? Oh, it's really quiet today. It's really, really, really quiet. Well,
Jade,
half of that.
Jade. Hello?
Yes, Susan, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to say that I had not thought and had not read about the 4 different classifications that he made at the beginning. That was very interesting. And I'm going back and read at least one of those books, the one by the woman, I can't remember her name, but I'll go back and look at the tape. And that was very interesting. And I have been on some of those tours at some of those places years and years ago. I know you've heard this story where we waited until the end of the tour, and then we asked, where where were the slave cabins? Where were all the people who made the life possible? And so had this mansion built for his daughter when she got married. Yeah, but who built it? And so that was very interesting. And I'm so glad that he made me aware of that. Ian, I'm so glad you made me aware of those 4 different classifications. And I will now look at each one of those tours and any other tour I go on through that frame of reference. I think In the Shadows has now tried to create this kind of juxtaposition between Mary Weeks and Louisa. And I don't think it goes far enough, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And I have taken the Whitney tour, which was a step beyond. And now I sort of understand why there's some other things that are left out of that, because of course they're trying to do something different. So that was very interesting to hear about those 4 classifications. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's much more complex even than that, probably. Like, I remember going on a tour at Whitney that Dr. Seck led, and I don't know if anybody here was on it, but it was the day after the conference I'd organized, and an artist, Dred Scott, was with us, and he had various critiques, which were interesting to hear. So, like, ones that do like a relatively exemplary job, like the Whitney, right? There's still areas that are up for debate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I've been on a Dr. Seck-led tour too. I was just kind of surprised. It wasn't enough. And neither was the new Shadows tour. I want more. And so, there's some more things to think about.
Yeah, there you go. So Susan, Pat said you should just do the tour yourself. You just make a tour and we'll do it.
Well, I was on the tour with Phoebe, and Phoebe kept, she kept adding to the tour. So I'm sure whoever our guide was like feeling, because Phoebe just added. And so it was different, going with Phoebe because she added more to it, a different context.
Yeah, and I should also, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I should note that there's actually someone I noticed in the audience, Dr. Skipper, who's much more expert on these topics than me. So, maybe a suggestion for someone to bring in the future.
We will take that note. And now Whitney's, we took our guides this summer, and Whitney is now audio tour entirely. So it's a completely different experience from the first couple of times that I went, where they were guide led.
Mm-hmm. Well, that narrows your questions. Oh, it does? Okay. Well, how do you get your questions answered?
It works. And I don't know. I don't know if the guided tour will come back at Whitney. I myself am not a really big fan of audio tours just because I like the guide interaction. But with Whitney, with what they're doing, what they're trying to do, we liked the audio tour because you get to go at your own pace. You can stop at those points where you want to really like think about what you've heard, the stories that have been told, and reflect on it. And you have the time to take your time, whereas when you're on the tour, it's more of just it's very controlled, and they're like, oh no, we have to move on. But you're like, but no, I want to sit here and I want to read this whole panel and I want to think about what you've told me. So it works there. I personally.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm in a very different context from the rest of you. I'm not working on a plantation, but I am part of an effort to restore a church that's on the historic register. And the man who donated all the money and the land to build this church was a slave owner. And so as we try to get this structure rebuilt, it's about to collapse. We're frequently asked questions like, why should we bother with this structure if it was built by this kind of a person? And so how do we be truthful, like you said, to telling the story? And how far do we go, I guess, is a question.
I mean, that's a good question, and maybe some other people in the audience will also have thoughts. I mean, for me, I think it's important to see, the roots of organizations, right, and be upfront about those. So I know there's a group I work with, along with at least one other person in the audience, who in Lafayette, that is a site that interprets Cajun, Creole, and Native American history as their mission. And I think one of the things we've been working to do there is, as people enter the village portion, it's a living history museum, have a map showing the site over time, right, from the indigenous inhabitants, Takapa and so on, to and then to the appropriation of that land by the French, more or less, and then showing it as a plantation site. We had a temporary exhibit that my students put together that did the plantation part of that I think was fairly successful, and just sort of pushing for recognition. But I don't know. I think it's a difficult question to always grapple. I mean, I'm always in favor of going as far as you can, but I think like the way to do that is often specific to the particular site. Yeah, I mean, I tend to just push for things being upfront, but I work, in U.S. history and public history at a university, so I often view my role as a public historian as being someone who helps groups get to their goals rather than someone who defines how things should be. Often, I'm someone who is coming from outside of the place I live, in Lafayette, for example, and it's not necessarily, to my mind, totally my place to be telling people exactly how to do things, so much as working with interested groups in order to get to where they need to be, as long as it's sort of within, ethical bounds. Yeah, that's not a great answer to your question, but maybe others have better thoughts.
Sure it is. I think you tell the truth. I think you have a panel someplace that explains who gave it, and give some history of him, who he was, what he did, what he owned, who the people he thought he owned, and then some context as to the time when he gave it. Did he give this land during Reconstruction? You know, and then people draw their own conclusions as to what his motive might have been, because certainly this is not the first. One of the churches that I go to was also given by one of the prominent white families, and it's basically was in the middle of the sugarcane acreage. So we know that it you know, it was given as a result of the fact that they owned all of these people in that area. They owned all of the land, and as I guess a token, during Reconstruction, they gave them this couple of acres to build a church. But these people still, of course, worked at that same mill and worked in those same sugarcane plantations. I just think you tell the truth, you know, tell exactly. And then I don't see how anybody can draw any other conclusion but that perhaps he gave it, I don't know, from his largesse, you know, or maybe he felt guilty about something, or maybe he didn't, you know, because of course the church is, you know, some people believe that Christianity is just a sop for us anyway. So I just think you tell the truth.
Yes, I'm not sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. I actually just posted a consultant, Richard Josie, that helps institutions with some of these issues. He's been doing this for quite a while and has helped several people that I know, and it's through Collective Journeys. So I posted a little bit about him and then also a link to his site.
Well, what do you think about that answer, about that question?
You mean me, the person that posed the question?
Yes, and also, I mean, Dr. Singer also.
Oh.
Dr. Skipper.
Yeah.
Both of you.
I mean, I think we have to address it because in community meetings, people are bringing it up. So it seems to be widely known fact that this man who donated this land and all the money to build this historic structure was a slave owner. Because I mean, I live in a totally different part of the US than you guys. I live in Western North Carolina in the mountains, and we didn't have a lot of slavery here, but we had some. And so like of maybe 3 or 4 families in this area that owned slaves, this man was one of them. So I think if anyone's ever going to tell the story, it needs to be part of this historic structure, because there's just not anyone else that's going to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it's something you certainly have to.
And I mean, I'm just for telling the whole truth. Dr. Skipper, say something.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you do have to include these difficult stories. I mean, there's not much about history that isn't difficult. I would just suggest that you really find people who can help you think through these things, because it does take a lot of community work to do. I started working with a community in North Mississippi about 9 years ago, and they're private homeowners who have slave dwellings on their properties and have worked to interpret them. But it's something that you want to be very thoughtful about. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel, especially when there are several other people out there now who help with these kinds of interpretations.
Yes, Doc.
One comment on keeping the church that they are rebuilding and all that. At one point, the Shadows didn't have to be there. They were going to tear it down to put a gas station. Think if it had been torn down and all the other plantation houses and things of that nature, how would there be a place to tell the story? I mean, the Shadows almost got torn down for a gas station, because I heard the story many times. And there would be no place to tell the story. New Ivory would just be a normal town, but at least has a place to tell the story.
Well, I agree with that too. I think that's important, because as much as slavery, is a bitter pill for me, it's also the truth of my existence. It's probably why I'm here in America. And I mean, and a lot of, the explanation given to me at the whatever that tour was that, well, people felt bad about slavery, and rather than offend any Black people, they just got rid of the cabins. Well, so am I more offended because you got rid of the cabin, or am I more offended because it's not here, because I'm left out of the story?
Mm-hmm. Any other comments, questions to continue this discussion? Okay. Well, did you have any last words, Ian? Dr.
No,
Beamish?
I don't think so. I was glad to see the conversation developing. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing lots of people around the Lafayette area in the future.
Okay. Well, so we would like to thank you for joining us virtually today for this presentation. And so, as Pat mentioned earlier, this does close out our speaker series, telling the full history. All 4 of these presentations, though, have been recorded. And hopefully, if the technology is working, we will have everything up on our website by the end of the month. That is the goal. And so that would include the recordings as well as any supplemental material. So like the reading list that Ian mentioned, and there's reading lists from the other presentations and those sorts of things. And if you have any other comments or any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us here at Shadows through email or phone. And then we're also on social media and have our e-newsletter. But thank you for joining us.